Hi class, just as a reminder to please do have a notebook and a pen in front of you and to listen to this video with earphones so you're not disturbed by outside noises. Please turn off your email applications and your cell phone so that you're not disturbed, and you might want to turn off Facebook so that you're not getting messenger notifications. Okay, let's get started. This chapter is called Abbasid Decline and the Spread of Islamic Civilization to South and Southeast Asia. Catchy title, no? So the key points of the chapter in Stearns are that the Abbasid Caliphate, which began, if you recall, in 750, remember the first caliphate started in 650 and lasted 100 years. So the Abbasid Caliphate began in 750, but started to decline pretty soon thereafter. But that decline was slow and painful. So the decline started soon after the start of the caliphate, but the decline itself was slow. As it declined politically, Islamic civilization spread and flourished. So we'll talk about what that means. Another point is that Abbasid society was more strictly patriarchal than previous Islamic dynasties. Okay, and actually more strictly patriarchal than the Persian Empire before it or the Byzantine Empire. And then Islam spread to South and Southeast Asia and changed to adapt to those cultures as it spread. So an example of syncretism. Here you can see a map of the Abbasid Empire. You can see during the period of its greatest strength, you have this pink line that sort of emphasizes where the area of its biggest extent was. This area here in Spain was also under Islamic control, but not under Abbasids. Actually, the fleeing Umayyads set up their own caliphate in Spain and North Africa over on the west side of the map here. So the next page shows sort of, again, that same region. The dark green region is the Abbasid Caliphate's greatest extent. But quickly we see that the Abbasids by the 9th and 10th century CE had really divided up into different regions. So let's talk about how that happened. So part of the problem was a focus on luxury, and this was a problem also with the Umayyads. If you've ever heard of the 1001 Nights, the stories of sort of the harems and the rich, lavish palaces, that's based off of Baghdad during the Abbasid Caliphate. So there was a focus on luxury and not a lot of focus on good government. And in fact, the governors, the caliphs, depended a lot on Persian advisors imported from conquered regions here in what used to be Persia. So those Persian advisors were brought in, and as we've seen before, using advisors from a different region can often lead to sort of factions within the empire, and the Persian advisors would sort of compete with each other for control. They would pit sons of the caliph against each other, and they led to general chaos within court. There was also a lack of a succession plan, which contributed to that chaos. It wasn't established that the caliph would pass the caliphate down to his oldest son, as it was in some monarchies. The succession was sort of up in the air, and the precedent was set early on that basically the sons of the caliph and his highest advisors would all sort of struggle for the throne, and there would be assassination attempts and intrigue with court and pitting, concubines and wives against each other and sort of using the people in court to sort of fight for the throne. And that set a bad precedent, which leads to sort of chaos and not sort of a stable plan of succession and a stable empire. One son in the sort of fight for succession built up a bodyguard army of some 4,000 slaves. He mostly used Turkish-speaking nomads as his slaves, and those Turkish-speaking nomads came from here in the Central Asian steppes. That region was often they were nomadic peoples that converted to Islam as they came in contact with the Abbasids. So the son built up an army of 4,000 slaves of these nomads, and then by the time he became the caliph, he built up that army to 70,000 to sort of protect his rule. As you can probably imagine, as with the Roman Empire, when they used foreign armies, mercenary armies, meaning paid soldiers rather than soldiers that are fighting for their own country, you often have that army becoming its own sort of source of power and becoming difficult to control by the caliph. And that's indeed what happened. There were lots of assassinations by these armies against the caliphs and his sons. So the civil infighting that you see sort of rampant within the Abbasid period leads to a lot of cost for the empire. These internal wars and these internal fights led to the need for greater taxes of the peasantry within the region, and as happened with the Romans, as happened with the Han Dynasty, this led to peasant revolt because the peasants don't like to be taxed excessively. Okay. Also, contributing to this revolts and revolutions within the empire is the fact that there's still this Shia faction within the Sunni Abbasid dynasty, and the Shias are contributing to sort of the dissent within the empire and sort of inciting these revolts where they exist. So that's how we get to this sort of divided Abbasid decline. The Abbasids kept technically power until 1258 in Baghdad. Does anyone can anyone sort of point on the map to where you think Baghdad is? It's about here, okay? And so the Abbasids remained in power in Baghdad, but the separate regions within the empire remained sort of independently led with sort of nominal, meaning just in name only, allegiance to the caliph in Baghdad. Okay? So one of the big invasions that's really important is the invasions of the Seljuk Turks. They're an example of a nomadic invasion that takes control of an empire. So in 1050, the Seljuk Turks have taken over Baghdad, and they rule for 2 centuries over this green area in the middle here. And they rule over in the name of the Abbasid Caliph. So the Abbasid Caliph still exists, but they sort of are really controlled by the will of the Seljuk Turks leaders. Later in this unit, we'll see that the Seljuk Turks make the move into the Byzantine Empire. See how this extends into what used to be the Byzantine Empire? And they greatly weaken the Byzantine Empire in 1071. The Seljuk Turks are also significant in that they were empowered during the invasion by an unexpected source, the Western Europeans, who move into this region in the end of the 11th century. The Crusades, as you may have heard of in the end of the 11th century, were religiously motivated, but also politically and economically motivated, and they were rallied by the Pope, because remember, there's no centralized power in Western Europe. It's really just religious power that unites Western Europe at this time. So it's the Pope that rallies people from France, Spain, Italy to invade into the region controlled by the Seljuk Turks, nominally the Abbasid Empire. They say that they're going to save Constantinople, the Christian capital, from the Seljuk Turks, but what actually happens is they bypass Constantinople. Actually, they took a land route for the most part, but some did take the sea route. But when they took the land route, they went right by Constantinople, right by the Seljuk Turks' invasions into the Byzantine Empire, and moved right to where they wanted to go, which was Jerusalem. Oh, excuse me, Jerusalem is right here. And in 1099, Jerusalem is taken mostly because the Seljuk Turks and the Abbasids were not expecting a Western invasion, because there really was no Western power to be afraid of at the time. The Seljuk Turks didn't see the Crusaders as much of a threat, and they basically left them in the Holy Land for approximately 100 years until they could sort of sort their own internal conflicts out, which they thought were more important. And then when there was finally a unification of the Abbasid area under a strong ruler named Saladin, the Crusaders were ousted. So they really only held the Holy Land for about 150 years. The impact of the Crusades was really more impactful for the Western Europeans than it was for the Muslims. It really intensified European borrowing from the Muslim world because from their sort of setting up of shop in the Holy Land, in this area here, they were given access for the first time to the Muslim sciences, the Muslim math, technology, philosophy, and literature that both the Muslims had developed themselves and they had compiled from Greek, Indian, and Arab sources together. And it really sparked the Europeans' desire for Eastern trade goods because here in this sort of central area they were seeing the beautiful silks and the cotton textiles and the spices and the oils that were sort of the riches of the East for the first time. The final nail in the coffin of the Abbasid Empire was in 1258. And in 1258, that's when one big nomadic invasion finally takes down the capital, and you have sort of the downfall of Baghdad in 1258 by the Mongols. The Mongols actually take down Baghdad in 1258 and then continue their move into Cairo and Egypt, where they finally lose to the Mamluks, who were Turkish slave armies that had basically taken over the Fatimids in Cairo. So another key point from the chapter is to talk about the Abbasid patriarchy. So some of the things that you may have heard about Islamic civilization, about how the treatment of women is really originated not from Muhammad, but from the Abbasids themselves. So in the Abbasid era, you have the creation of the harem, which was a court of luxury in the sort of an element of the luxurious court of the Abbasids, where women were confined to the forbidden quarters of the palace, as you can see in the bottom left picture. Sort of women stayed separate from the rest of the palace. Slave women and men who were prized for both their beauty and intelligence lived in the court. And so the slaves actually were given more education and more liberty than the free, quote-unquote, free wives, because the slave women were able to go to the market and they could wear what they wanted, whereas the wives of the caliph and the upper class of the Abbasids had to wear veils and they had to stay cloistered within the home. Peasants, on the other hand, peasant women contributed to farm work. They wove cloth and rugs for sale, or sometimes they raised silkworms, contributing to their family's income, whereas rich women were allowed basically no option beyond the home and often were married at the legal age of 9 years old. The only sort of opening that women had to influence their lives in politics was within the court, sort of that intrigue that I was talking about, sort of whispering in people's ears and sort of spreading rumors to sort of help their sons to come to power within the court. So while Abbasid Empire politically is on the decline, that does not stop the spread of Islam, the religion, or Islamic civilization. So you can see here in this map.